Hello, this is the third and final introductory session. I'm struggling to get started here. This is the third and final introductory session for Delivering the Impossible today. I'm going to take the opportunity, the fact that I've got no punters, there's nobody listening, to talk about something that I get to further on. If I were doing this as a full show, this would be something that I get to further on, which is something that I promised in the introduction. So if you've looked at one of the other videos here that does the introduction, I promised this earlier on, but I haven't actually quite got to it, which is different ways of looking at projects that are actually useful and helpful. So the point that I make in the introduction is that point of view is worth 80 IQ points. Well, what sorts of things, what ways of seeing things can make you like a genius rather than like an idiot? And I've got a list. I'm going to start by talking about something called the swamp, or that's the way I imagine it. And this is kind of the idea that any kind of complex environment in which you're trying to deliver a project is like a swamp, in that hear me out. Here's how it's like a swamp. It's got things that are submerged, it's got things that you don't know about that are in there, that are hidden by the water, that you're going to stumble on as you start trying to work in that area. This swamp might have people who already live in it. It might have inhabitants. It's probably, these might be people who live there, but if it's a real swamp, almost all swamps, it seems to me, like from news about ecological objections, have rare newts, right? So there's all sorts of other species. There are other things that are going on in there that kind of need to be protected, maybe dangerous. Maybe it's a swamp that has snakes in it and poisonous frogs or whatever, right? So this is a complex environment with all sorts of things going on, and it's an existing ecosystem. That's the other thing to understand. This thing is already there, and it's working in a certain way as an ecosystem. And the other thing to think about with a swamp is, yes, you've got people who live there. You've got people who've paid you to work in that environment, right? So this swamp has got some kind of owners. It's got people who want you to do work in that swamp. It may also have people who want to come and occupy this swamp after you've done your work. So there are kind of potential buyers, there are potential investors, there are owners, there are all these kinds of people who have all this influence on this swamp. The other thing that is going on in this swamp is there are other people. You remember I talked about the newts and all of the kind of environmental wildlife in there. There are other people who may never go near this swamp, who may have no interest in actually going and live in this swamp, haven't invested anything in this swamp, don't own this swamp, but yet still have some kind of regulatory power over this swamp. Or maybe they don't have any regulatory power, but they just have the power of campaigning. They want to save those newts, right? So the idea, I'll come back to kind of how this is relevant to business in a second, but this is the idea that kind of it's very important to understand about any kind of project environment that you're working in, is that it's a complex environment. There are lots and lots of different things going on there. There are different kinds of residents, there are different kind of interested parties, there are different kind of laws and rules and regulations that affect this part of swamp. And if you ignore these things as you go in, or if you only pay attention to certain of these things, like they're the only thing that is of interest, you will encounter problems. You will find yourself stuck in various ways. Now, so what can you do about this? What can you do about this if you're on a project to make sure that you know as much as you can about the swamp? So in software development terms, and I'm sure for other kinds of projects there are other kinds of things which are similar, the most important thing that you can do is user research. Talk to the people who live in the swamp, talk to the people who want to live in the swamp, talk to the people who are paying for development in the swamp, talk to the owners, talk to as many people as you can who are related to this swamp, and draw a map. Start to see who all the influencers are who have some kind of effect on this swamp, a stakeholder map. Now the crucial thing here is don't just do this once. don't just do this at the beginning, because one of the crucial things about thinking about this as a swamp or as a complex project environment is that it's dynamic. So as you start to make changes, as you start to do things in this environment, you will have an effect on kind of the residents of the swamp, the people who want to move into the swamp, the owners of the swamp who want you to do this, the people who regulate it. All of this stuff you will affect by what you're doing. You will have a dynamic effect on it. And so this is really important, that you kind of continue to do user research. Now, one of the things that's very difficult is that some of those people might not want to talk to you for various reasons. So maybe the residents in the swamp are really pissed off that somebody's building anything in that swamp. They might not want to talk to you. So that might be a difficulty. Some of the people who are funding this might not think that it's important that they explain to you why are they funding it. Some of the people who are regulating it, the people who are funding it might not want you to talk to them and alert them to what's going on. So there are all sorts of difficulties around understanding this, but it's important to understand that things that you can do to understand how this regulatory, how this complex environment is and how it's changing are very important for a project. One of the other things about this kind of environment is it can just change. Lots of things can happen in business environments. You know, I'm mixing my metaphors now, but in business environments, people move on, new laws come into being, the weather changes, and maybe that's the good analysis, a good analogy when I'm talking about swamps. The weather changes, right? And so this is stuff that needs to be kept abreast of while you're doing a project. And one way is user research. The other way, and this might seem really counterintuitive, I've got two other things which are good ways of keeping abreast of what's going on in the swamp, is working software. So in other kind of project situations, there's a finished product or some kind of prototype. Any time that you can get something which is an instantiation, some kind of view of what the real thing at the end of the project will look like, and then you can get reactions. You can get reactions from the people who live in the swamp, get reactions from the people who want to live in the swamp, from the people who funded you to go there. You can get those reactions, and that tells you that's kind of a way of finding out more about what that environment is really like. So user research and asking questions is absolutely brilliant. When you have designs, you can do more research on the designs. But actual working things, getting reactions to working things, is even more informative or complementary. All of these things are complementary. Finally, the other thing that I found really useful is, and this sounds a bit more technical, but it's all the way through a project to show your progress to all of the people who are involved. Make in agile terms, this is called a show and tell. Report your progress every 2 weeks. Show what you're doing to as many people as possible, and also kind of like talk about the risks that you know to the project. My experience is that if you talk about the risks that you know of that are related to a project, with the kind of stakeholders, with the people who want the project to happen, and with the people who are funding it, etc., you find out lots of other things that you didn't know. Things change. You have to. I'm getting rained on. I'm going to soldier on in the rain because I've only got 6.5 minutes to go. Yes, so that's the swamp. I was intending to talk about lots of different things, but I'm going to talk about swamp, and I'm going to move on to talking about another thing, which is escape. This is related. I talked about working software, about the value of getting something that does the thing that this project is supposed to do. And in my experience, it's really weird that this is one of the most controversial aspects of trying to do a project, especially with software, but I think it's also the same with other kinds of things as well. Is that what I mean by escape is, if you're in this kind of project bubble, what you want to try and do is to get something to the outside, something to the people who really want to use this thing, who really want to need it, as fast as you can. And sometimes it feels like being in a prison camp and having to plot an escape. And why it feels so like that is for many reasons, but one is that there are all sorts of rules and regulations for getting things to the outside. If you're in a big organisation, if you're doing something controversial in somewhere or it's highly regulated, there are all sorts of regulations for getting something actually out to real people. And one of the kind of reasonings, or kind of one of the reactions to that from a lot of people who are involved in the project, is to just not try to get it anywhere near out into the real world, to just not bother. And my experience is, the only way that you're really going to get to the outside fence and escape is if you keep trying to escape. If so like maybe you're not allowed to show this thing to real members of the public, but you could show it to other people in another department in the organisation. You could show them a working version of this. Maybe you're not allowed to get this out of the organisation with real live data. But could you get it out with fake data? Could you show people dummy data? Maybe you don't have a live server that you're allowed to put it on, but do you have a test server? Every bit that you can get the thing further and nearer to the outside, to real people, even when it's only a small thing with limited functionality, gives you a better chance of succeeding. And why would you get resistance to this? Well, it comes back to something that I talked about in the first talk that I did today, which is the whole notion of the desert, and the process of putting together the value stream, putting together some actual value around the thing that you're building, undermines the idea. Now, so I've kind of experienced this myself over the last few days, actually, because I've started to do these talks, having talked about doing them for a good long while. I've actually started to do these talks, and they're not as impressive as I thought they were going to be. They're this kind of tiny little thing. I want more jokes. I would love that if this was in a theatre, for it to have a musical number, I kid you not, and costumes, and to be more entertaining. And really it's just this pitiful little thing which is a talk that's on the green, and so it's kind of embarrassing. I'm doing all of these roles at the moment on my project. I'm the person who had the idea, and I'm the person trying to implement it, and I'm kind of embarrassed at where it is. But also I know, because I'm a project manager, that the only way to really get this over the line and to really deliver is to put this thing, this pitiful thing, and to get it out to real people. And I've already had 2 customers. I've already had 2 people looking at what I'm delivering. And one of the things that struck me when I was talking about this morning is how kind of few words we have, how kind of few phrases, how little thinking we have about like a brand new idea, not the kind of idea, but the kind of the first implementations of it, the first inklings, the first sketches. This is not something that we celebrate as a culture. Maybe other cultures do, but this thing, kind of like a thing which is just starting out, and most of the things that it's supposed to do, it doesn't yet do, but it still has some value. This is not something that we celebrate as a culture, and that's part of the reason, because this is not a kind of standard thing to do. This is part of the reason why getting working software out to users, genuine users, is such a struggle, because the people who fund projects, the people who have the ideas for projects, they're not used to the idea of this pitiful little thing being shown, and they're worried that it's going to, the phrases that come up very often are reputational damage. Are we going to look foolish? Are we going to look foolish if we do this? Well, it's interesting to see that kind of some of the biggest organisations who do software are quite comfortable with putting out very early versions of things. And also, like in the free software world, people tend to put out very early versions, like versions before that aren't 1.0 versions, 0 point something versions of things that are barely there, that barely work, and then kind of like offer to other people, like saying, look, could you help us improve this? So this is a real secret to the thing that I talk about in the first talk that I had today, was this desert between the idea and building the value stream. This is one of the fundamental secrets of that, is working software. if you can get something working and you can attach it to some value from some users, then you will get this magical thing called pull, which I talked about again in an earlier talk today. You will get somebody who wants some of what you're doing, and this radically changes the dynamic of the project that you're working on. Thanks a lot.